But I just want to appreciate the introduction from Brett and thank Columbia Riverkeeper as well for and our staff from ERWM for the ability to offer some words here, obviously in recognition to a long-standing effort and everyone being aware. That's why Dr. Russell Jim and his significant and substantial work, along with other historical leaders of our nation and other representations throughout our territories. But I guess I need to open with a disclaimer. Number one, I'm not here to hurt anyone's feelings. And so if anything that I say strikes you in a unique or way, it's not intended to do so. And number two, I refuse to be held responsible for anything that comes out of my mouth. And so I want to make that clear, because when it comes to this discussion, and obviously the highlights of the last few decades going back historically to the great and substantial work that has been brought forth by the man that we honor here today and others. But I've always looked at this discussion and in my representation of being sitting at our table as a council member and the council asking me to carry on in the chair's duties. Oftentimes I'm visiting our issues and I'm trying my best to appropriately frame the context by which the issue should be discussed. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about the context of this issue, because there's some very significant and historical actions that are framing the way that we discuss, the way that we understand, and the limitations that are provided with regard to what we can collectively do about the issues associated with the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. And I think that historically, there's something that happened that's affecting this discussion. In the 15th and 16th centuries, there were actions that were conducted by the Roman Catholic Church. And historically, there was popes who said at that time, they issued what they called papal bulls. Those papal bulls in that time were brought forth to various monarchies. Those monarchies, two of them that were significant to eventual so-called or proclaimed discovery of this area and territory known as the United States of America, the monarchies of Spain and later the monarchy of England, utilized these papal bulls. In a sense, they were holy marching orders. Holy marching orders to do what? Well, if you look at the history associated with these actions conducted by the Roman Catholic Church, these holy marching orders that were distributed to these monarchies, essentially in the name of the church, gave them the authority to exert dominion. Dominion. What is dominion? Well, I think everybody has an understanding. It's to exert an ability to conquer, exert dominion over all lands, waters, and said inhabitants of lands, if those inhabitants were deemed to be infidels and are heathens, or what the church proclaimed to be unbaptized people. And so that is history. It's dark, because you're talking about the discovery of this continent and the assertions of the monarchy of Spain to lay claim and exert a holy dominion expressed by the church, and later England doing the same things. So that's pretty significant with regard to how you frame this discussion, because eventually these holy marching orders, they found themselves in the development of the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches of the United States of America. And specifically within the judicial branch, there's something that occurred historically that has very significant, I guess you can say, reference with regard to the context of this discussion. There was a case that happened in the United States Supreme Court in 1823. The case is called Johnson Lessee versus McIntosh. In this case represents the foundation and are the origin of what others and what society knows as federal Indian law. It was the first time that the United States had to challenge itself to assert jurisdiction over a dispute that involved title of land. So this is not only the origin of federal Indian law, this is the origin of property law. This is the exertion to have an understanding where title, or so-called legal title of land and our other resources comes from the United States perspective. That case happened in 1823. Justice John Marshall, I guess you can say, maybe he struggled with regard to what kind of justification that the United States would utilize in its ability to assert jurisdiction and assert title over property. Well, ironically enough, this is history. Justice John Marshall brought forth the doctrine of Christian discovery, and he utilized it in the ruling to assert the justification for the United States to rule that indeed the property dispute, which represented the land case at hand, it said that the United States had inherited the doctrine of Christian discovery that was brought forth by the monarchies of Spain and England. And that's a pretty unique thing that happened historically. It's pretty unique. And what the doctrine of Christian discovery states from the Roman Catholic Church is that by conduct of ceremony, when Cristobal Colon arrived in Honduras and when John Cabot arrived on the East Coast, there was a ceremony that was conducted to exert dominion over said lands, waters, and inhabitants. And that, so this is true history with regard to the United States' original assertion of title to property, to this ground that we stand upon here, to this river floating by here. And I guess you can say I'm one of the descendants of the infidels. And this was the justification that's been brought forth throughout time, that when you get into a discussion of how Hanford came to be, what happened historically to essentially exert a modern day dominating and dehumanizing act, such as the inception, the origin, the continued existence, and the challenges with regard to cleanup of Hanford Nuclear Reservation. Well, there's another thing that happened historically that should help frame this context of this discussion. That indeed, if in 1823 the United States utilized a falsified religious pretense to assert jurisdiction and title over lands that are the original territories of our peoples, then what else happened? In 1855, there was a treaty between the Yakama Nation and the United States federal government. The articles of that treaty memorialized the reserved rights of what our ancestors held true. The representations of those articles represent a following of our way of life that our ancestors and our historical chiefs knew that if these things cease to be, the Yakama will cease to be. And so they attempted and memorialized in the negotiations that happened at that treaty an ability for those promises to be fulfilled from now until ever. So if this case happened in 1823, this treaty happens in 1855. There's other things that happen that are framing the context of this discussion that we're having. There was another case that happened in the United States Supreme Court. It's called U.S. versus Kagama. U.S. versus Kagama is a unique case. What it does, it essentially, in the very simplest sense, it says what Congress says goes. But what it does is it gives Congress, through legislative act, an ability to renegotiate the Treaty of 1855. I mean, that's what it's done for Yakamas. It's also done that to other things throughout time. So as a person who sits in the role that I do my best to fulfill today, I try to understand what has happened historically, what has happened to build us up to the history of the present moment, and how could something as devastating as the Hanford Nuclear Reservation continue in the manner that it has, And how is it that all that has happened since the War Powers Act was enabled? The land grab, all right? There was no consultation, if that's what you wish to call it, with the Yakama leaders of that time, or the Yakama peoples, or the displaced Wanapums, or any of the others who were affected during that time period, about the seizure of additional title to land and our property. And I guess it's a unique thing because it was in preparation for a great dispute that the United States was engaged in called World War II. And we all know history there and the necessity with regard to what the Manhattan Project developed and the outcome 6 days later after the bomb was dropped to end that war. So there could be, I guess you can say, serious and responsible discussions about the sacrifice that's been endured by this land, by this water, by the different entities and resources, and by the peoples who were affected. But there and again, are we truly discussing this entire thing in the proper context? Because when you go back to U.S. versus Yakama, and when it exerted to have the legislative branch of the United States federal government to have an extra constitutional authority to exert legislative acts that supersede such things as the Treaty of 1855 between the Yakama Nation and the United States. And we take exception to that because in the U.S. Constitution, Article 6, Section 2, in the clause, it states that treaties are the highest law of the land. All states are thereby bound to. And for the Yakama Nation, we wonder, how is it that you can take the U.S. Constitution that has provisions that exert the Treaty of 1855 between the Yakamas to be the highest law of the land? And how does that balance and interact with the War Powers Act? How does that balance and interact with the judicial precedent that was set in 1823? The judicial precedent that was set by U.S. versus Yakama? Because here's a little secret for you. As much as this judicial precedent and the justification that was utilized in 1823 was as relevant as it was then, it's still happening today. It's still happening today. Because we can take the citations with regard to the judicial actions that have been conducted by Yakama Nation specific to the disputes surrounding the Hanford Reserve here, and you'll look at the legislative acts and the judicial precedent that the United States and other entities have utilized. That judicial precedent, case law, anyone who has ever read a case, you'll read the arguments and you'll read the brief, and then you'll go down to the bottom of the page, and if there's any cases that are cited, they're going to cite those cases because that's the last judicial precedent that's either utilized by the United States Supreme Court or the different districts and our circuits that are brought forth for arguments to justify the decision-making process. But here's an exercise for you to do when it comes to these disputes. Go to the briefs that have been brought forth with regard to the defense to continue the actions that have happened historically and continue to do the song and dance of supposed cleanup. And if you trace those citations that are in that case law, where do you think it traces to? Anyone got a guess? 1823. Johnson Lessee versus McIntosh. The utilization of a false religious pretense to exert an authority, which is inherited from a unholy right to exert dominion over all lands, waters, and peoples. So I ask myself, are we properly talking about this issue? Have we properly framed the context by which we are engaging in discussions and advocacies to do the right thing on behalf of the resource, on behalf of the peoples affected, historically, currently, and into the future? Well, I don't believe we are. I don't believe we are. Because the recent history established with the type of deceit that has been brought forth since the 1940s is substantial. And that's the difference about Hanford with some of the other nuclear facilities out there, is the kind of deceit that's been associated with this reserve. Documented deceit. Documented release of contaminants that have substantial detriment to the resource, to our livelihoods, to our current existence, to our children's existence, their children's existence. How far into the future? And if you're going to talk domination, or a dominating act, an exertion of an unholy right of domination, I'd say that the outcome of that domination, specific to this discussion, is the dehumanization that each and every one of us experience for our peoples collectively, regardless of background, race, origin, whatever it may be. And so, something to think about. If you don't believe my words, go look it up. Go look it up to see if what I am expressing is truthful or if it's deceit. And if it is truthful, if this is the reality of the history of the present moment, then those of us who wish to advocate to take action, to advocate for solutions, to advocate for proper and responsible decision making from various jurisdictions and entities who are involved in this issue, are we truly going about it with the proper context by which we are engaging in our advocacy? Because if there is a very strong, dominating and dehumanizing act that's occurring against the Yakama Nation and its peoples, I'd say at the top of the list, there's a number of things that are there, but one of the things towards the top is Hanford. It's Hanford. And we go through the practical reality of, I would never proclaim that the representatives that come from the various agencies within DOE and the other associations with regard to the jurisdictions involved in this picture, I would never proclaim that any of those individuals are deceitful and are evil or encourage wrongdoing. I believe they are put in a predicament that is unfortunate. But have they truly analyzed the context by which their representation is coming forth from the entity or the jurisdiction or the stance that they take with regard to this picture that we're looking at? Anyway, I kind of pondered what I'd expressed today because I want it to be beneficial. And there's perhaps maybe some ears or hearts or minds in this gathering here as we continue to take as best and as strongest steps as we can to develop a future that's more positive than what we realize and understand today. But one thing I have a question is when are we going to get the disclosure with regard to just how bad the picture is that we're looking at? I don't know, I hear representations about different expressions that have happened from federal representation and agencies and throughout time. And it's like we go through this ebb and flow. Sometimes we almost get a little bit more truthful representations with regard to the true state of the affairs, and other times we get stonewalled. So I would just say, in the spirit of someone as beautiful and as strong as an elder that I can look up to his life, the representations of the steps that he took in his life, that's why Russell Jim and other beautiful, strong men and women of the Yakama Nation and of other followings and backgrounds, to say, okay, if we're truly going to make a stand here, what type of stand will that be that's going to ensure that we're doing the best we can to present a future to our children that's worth existing in? So either way, I can get into a bunch of the practical things that are happening today, but I can tell you, I'll make it nice and short and sweet. A whole bunch of deceit, a whole bunch of non-truth, a whole bunch of interactions that are non-effective. And with regard to having an understanding, we take as much practical steps as we can to empower our staff, to empower the ones who have the tools, to empower the other entities and organizations and agencies who are trying to do the right thing here. But something's missing. Something's missing because collectively, with all the goodness of everyone who's involved to try to do the right thing, it's almost like we're being dominated. And it's almost like I feel dehumanized by that dominating act that exists at a level that we can't quite comprehend. And my understanding of trying to comprehend that is that we are discussing this in the wrong frame of context. So I'll share that much, and I appreciate the ability to stand on this ground next to this beautiful enchilada on this beautiful day with each of you, that hopefully within the true followings of our collective ways of life, that future that we all wish to have will come upon all of us for the greatest benefit of the right thing to do. So I thank you. Lakush.